Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar organised by migrantrights.org on Kafala abolishment. Obviously a very timely and urgent issue. My name is Fabien Goa. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a human rights researcher specialising in labour rights in the GCC and corporate accountability. I've worked as a human rights researcher with Amnesty International, focusing on migrant rights in the GCC, working as a consultant with businesses trying to improve their labour practices and treatment of workers, especially the construction industry. I currently am working with Fair Square Projects as a project manager for a project called the 5 Corridors Project, which is examining recruitment practices of migrant workers in 5 different migration corridors globally, which includes a corridor from Nepal to 2 GCC corridors as well. So this is a topic that is very close to my heart, that I have a lot of interest in, and therefore I'm particularly grateful to migrantrights.org for inviting me to facilitate this discussion about Kafala abolition. I think all of us, anyone in this field knows that migrant rights is kind of the go-to vital resource. So I'm really delighted to be sharing this panel with Vani, Rima and Ali as well. The structure of how we'll go forward is essentially all 4 of us will take 5-minute turns to give kind of brief introduction to different themes that we want to discuss. And then we will have a curated discussion around some of the most pertinent issues that we think need to be addressed around Kafala abolition. And then that will last about 40 minutes. And then for the final 30 minutes of this event, we'll have a Q&A session. I should flag that we've actually received a lot of questions already through the registration process from many of you attending. So thank you very much for submitting those questions. We will kind of prioritize them during the Q&A. But if you go to the bottom of your screen and the 3 dots of the more, there is a Q&A function there, so you can submit more questions. And if we have time, we will try to involve them in that Q&A session at the end as well. And I should flag as well that this discussion is being recorded and will be added to the migrantrights.org YouTube channel as well after the event. So everyone here probably has some concept of what Kafala is, and also probably has some myths in our thinking, and also has many different questions about it as well. It's a predominant phrase in anyone interested in migration governance and in politics and political economy of the GCC and also other countries as well, including Jordan and Lebanon. So what I'll do with my kind of 5-minute intro before calling on Rima, I'll just kind of give a quick overview of what different people consider to be Kafala, why we're talking about abolition, some of the origins, and some of the shared features across the different systems. So I think one thing that we do want to emphasize in this discussion is that Kafala is not homogeneous. There are different forms of it, and they have different impacts for migrant workers, and they are essentially kind of variations on the system. So just to briefly touch on some of the origins of Kafala, and essentially to highlight that they are disputed. So calling on the work of Omar al-Shahabi, Anne Long, and also Matthew Hopper. There are essentially 2 kind of broad theories. One very much attached to British colonial rule in what became the GCC states, so especially in the period between 1920s and 1970s, essentially an administrative process for controlling labour migration, especially in the pearling industry and also the early formations of the oil industry as well. I think it's worth highlighting that one of the kind of statuses that was introduced in those periods was that of the bachelor worker. So from the very beginning and origins of the system, we have a gendered element from the start. And I think that's going to be something crucial to maintain in our discussions going forward, because I think it's difficult to divorce gendered impacts of Kafala in its modern form as well. And then there is some other theories about also Kafala essentially having quite cosmopolitan roots, if you look at it that way, in the sense of it being a responsibility that existed in a period of much lower migration, where a local would take on the responsibility of the well-being of essentially an outsider who came to the community, as I said, being responsible for their well-being, but also for their actions, implying some level of accountability. So they're just two kind of broad introductions to this idea. So now I want to move to what is Kafala today. Obviously, Kafala is practiced across, a form of it is practiced across all of the GCC countries, Jordan and Lebanon. And as I said, there are variations on the system. I think I'm going to just try and highlight what are the common factors, or more, the most common factors to all of these systems. Some recognizing that there are nuances and there have been some reforms as well, and also just pre-existing differences. I think the core, at its core, when we talk about Kafala, we're really talking about every migrant's immigration and employment status being tied to a single sponsor, or kafil, who's usually their employer as well. And so when you consider that, we're talking about the legal status, the residency status, and the ability to work being delegated from the state essentially to a private citizen or employer, and creating essentially quite a significant amount of dependency. And that is common to all of the Kafala systems in all its different formats across the region and different countries. Other key aspects to that is, so obviously when someone's entry is also tied to the kafil or the sponsor, and then you have an administrative process around renewal of residency. So either the initial kind of securing of residency and also renewal. So that's in the hands of the sponsor again. So creating a dependent kind of relationship, because if the sponsor does not process that renewal, the worker is in a quite vulnerable position. The other three aspects I'd highlight as well around termination of contract. Essentially, it's very difficult for migrant workers to be able to terminate contracts on their own. Essentially, they need, more often than not, need the permission and consent of their employer, often in written form, in order to be able to change sponsor. Or essentially to end their contract, to be able to resign from their position if they so wish, and to end their contract. And that obviously links to transfer as well, wanting to transfer sponsor and transfer jobs, again, needing an NOC or no objection certificate in many instances, essentially where the current employer still gets to determine whether their worker is able to legally transfer to another sponsor, another job, even in some cases, if their contract has expired after 5 years or after 2 years. So significantly affecting job mobility and freedom of movement. And in some instances, relatively few now, which we're pleased to say, the sponsor also has a lot of control over a migrant worker's ability to exit the country. So again, a significant imposition on a worker's freedom of movement, their ability to return home, which is a basic human right. It's relatively rare now, but still exists in at least one country, and did so until recently as well. I think the main kind of focus of our discussion will be about reform. I don't think there's a single GCC country in the past 10 years which has not had some proclamations about reform and has not introduced at least some laws. But the word used in the introduction or in the title of this event was abolition. And we've heard that word a lot from some states at the very top of their narrative around the reforms that they're processing, and others less. And so what we want to kind of dive into in this discussion is, what does abolition actually mean? Why, in some circumstances, do the actual reforms or laws which are passed fall short of what we would understand as abolition? And to what extent do they change the system, I think, is one key aspect we want to talk about. Kafala in its current form, I think it's fair to say, can be best understood as essentially a constant work supply of essentially temporary low-paid workers. The temporary, I would put in inverted commas, because in reality, a lot of workers may reside in a country for quite a long time, but essentially their legal status is always temporary and dependent on their sponsor to be able to kind of continue working free of abuse. The other aspect that I think we need to really consider when we discuss the reforms is coverage. At the moment, about 30 million migrants across the GCC are all subject to this system. And also, that equates to about half of the GCC population. So the scale of migrant workers who are subject to the system is very significant. And so when we talk about reforms, we need to keep in mind who is covered under these reforms, who benefits, who's excluded. And I think it's fair to say in many iterations of reforms that we have seen, often gendered industries where women predominantly perform those roles, those jobs, are often either excluded from initial reforms or still face significant obstacles in either benefiting from additional freedoms or, as I said, just sometimes written out of those reforms. I think the other lens that I just want to, for me, especially as a human rights researcher, we've talked about Kafala being essentially a delegation of responsibility to a private individual. When I think about reform of Kafala, I think about, is the government fulfilling its responsibility to protect the human rights of every resident, everyone within its borders? So that's the lens that I approach this, I think. And I think that a lot of this discussion will happen. Are migrant workers less at risk of forced labor as a result of these changes? Has enough been done, and does not more need to be done as well? So I will just draw to a close with that introduction and call on Rima to talk to us a bit about migrantrights.org, what it does, why it does, what it does, and why it's so important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fabian. Thank you for agreeing to facilitate. And thank you for that excellent introduction. I'm going to pick up on a few things that you mentioned after I introduce myself. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Rima Kalush. I'm the editor at migrantrights.org. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with us, we are a GCC-based advocacy organization working to advance the rights of migrant workers in the region. Currently, our work falls into three main buckets. So there's the research and the reporting that you see on the site, which then feeds into advocacy with employers of domestic workers, business, youth, embassies, anyone we can get our hands on, really. And all of this is possible by engaging a network across the migration corridors of migrants, community groups, CSOs, individual activists. And this gives us a sort of 360-degree view of the situation. When we started more than 15 years ago now, one of our main objectives, and it's still one of our main objectives, was to promote local discussion on migration and on migration issues. At that time especially, but to many degrees still now as well, there weren't a lot of reliable resources with local media constrained on what it could report, with the government, of course, not being very reliable, and international media kind of only dropping in on these issues every now and then, and not really understanding the local context. So a lot of what we wrote entailed countering, misinformation and challenging narratives on migration and migration issues. And one of our most popular early posts was pushing back against Bahrain's claim in 2009 that it abolished the sponsorship system, which a claim that we've had to keep correcting for the better part of a decade. And since then, we've really seen similar patterns in other countries where there's these initial announcements of reform that don't really have any details, and then it's followed with either a wholesale like backslide into nothing, or a dilution of what was practiced, or, as is increasingly the case, reforms that are implemented on paper, but not at all in practice. And there is often a lot of noise and coverage and applause when these reforms are announced, but very little interest in following up to see what actually happens. And so many of the reforms that we've seen so far, the most vulnerable are excluded, the most exploitative elements remain intact, or new obstacles are put in place which enable sponsors to retain a degree of control over changing jobs or leaving the country, for example. And I think one of the reasons for these enduring narratives is that information is still really distorted. It's still really difficult to access these places where you can't freely report. But there's also a misunderstanding, I think, and a misframing of what Kafala really means and what it would really mean to reform it. So what we hope to do in this discussion is to unpack some of these issues and to explore some under-discussed dimensions of the problem. Fabian, again, thank you for providing an excellent foundation upon which we can build upon. I especially really like that you mentioned that Kafala, as it applies to labor migration, is really a British import, because this gets at one of the oldest myths about the kafala, which is that it's part of the region's, cultural heritage, and it's for that reason that there has been resistance to reform. But as you pointed out, it's really only as old as the modern state bureaucracies themselves, and it's undergone many transformations. And at its core, it's really just a very strict employer-tied visa system, which we do see in many other parts of the world. I think the idiosyncrasies of the kafala is really its context, in which virtually all migrants are falling under the exact same system, in which there's a huge degree of dependence on migrant workers, and in which the environment doesn't allow for civil society to sort of buffer or challenge these protection gaps. So that was my introduction, but just a note before I pass it on to Vani, this is the first webinar that we're hosting independently, so any tech issues are my fault, and I apologize for them. We're also experimenting with different meeting styles, as Fabian mentioned, so this is kind of more of a discussion. Hopefully it will facilitate an interesting conversation. It is a learning process for us, so thanks for your patience. And with that, I will leave it to Vani to introduce herself.
One would think I'd learn to unmute, right? I've just did. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Rima, and thank you, Fabian. What I want to speak okay, I'm Vani Saraswati. I'm the editor at large and director of projects for migrantrights.org. So apart from writing for the organization, the second bucket that Rima mentioned, which is grassroots advocacy and community building, that's something that I work quite a bit on. Though I cover all of the GCC countries and the origin countries, I tend to focus on Qatar, where I lived for several years, and Kuwait, where we have a project on the ground, and of course, the countries of origin themselves. I'm going to look at, in the introduction, I want to look at who are the different people who are actually profiting from the kafala, because when we hear the term kafala, it's always that here are these rich GCC countries, and the government is going to get even wealthier out of this. And yes, there is truth in that the state does facilitate abuse, but there's more to it, right? So I just want to touch upon all of those things very briefly and go into detail for some of it during our discussions that will follow after Ali's introduction. So one thing that you keep hearing, that I've been hearing since 1999 when I first went to Qatar, is diversification, right? We know that the resources are drying up, and all of these countries want to see a different economic dynamic. So you will see the real estate development in Dubai, you'll see financial sectors coming up, which Bahrain did initially. And then in Qatar, it went into MICE, which is meetings, events, and sporting events, right? So you're always hearing about diversification. And often that actually means helping citizens find jobs and opportunities outside of public sector employment. And this is something all of the countries struggle with. So they look at it and they push entrepreneurship, and you keep hearing this, you keep looking at every other month, you'll find a new incubation center being set up in one of the Gulf countries. The whole idea is to develop entrepreneurship locally. Unfortunately, a key component of whatever is being developed is labor recruitment, cheap labor recruitment, and easy labor management with minimal interference from government. So when you see governments introduce even the most basic of reforms, there is a pushback from citizens and private sector. There's a xenophobic narrative around why migrants should not be given, as if it was someone's possession to give away, given their rights. And then you see governments sometimes regressing, pushing back, trying to change that narrative. Because for a lot of people, they feel that by extending rights to migrant workers, their own privileges are being negated, as if it's a zero-sum game. And we know that's not true. And we see this very markedly in domestic work sector. This sector embodies the worst of the kafala provisions. Everything that is wrong with how migrant labor is managed in the GCC states is magnified in this sector, which is primarily feminized. The sponsor is then led to believe that it's their right to employ cheap labor, and it's their right to control them. So if you're setting up a business, it's because you don't have enough job opportunities. So the government has to help you get cheap labor. If you are employing a live-in domestic worker, it's because there aren't enough public welfare facilities. So the government should just allow you to recruit and control these workers. What this manifests as is control over mobility of workers, vindictive absconding charges, deprioritizing wage payment, and wage theft. And then throw into this mix the fact that a few powerful families or citizens will run the majority of businesses, say in Kuwait or in Saudi or in the UAE, or in smaller countries like, say, Bahrain or Qatar. What you'll find is that the families are so closely linked that, so you would have someone running a business, and the same family, there'll be someone in positions of power, and they're not going to facilitate accountability, right? They will protect their own. But that's not all. It's not all about citizens and citizens-run businesses. We must take into consideration that the kafala persists because stakeholders outside of these countries appear to benefit from it. You take big businesses that are wary of unionization or government interference. It is convenient for them to take none of the responsibility for the injustice under kafala and provide solutions. When we were talking a couple of days ago, in one of our prelim meetings, Fabian was mentioning about how American companies go in for committees within their organization instead of unionization. So we see this trend carrying forward, and it takes form of the solutions that big corporations put forward, takes the form of welfare standards, ethical recruitment, joint committees, fantastic, commendable things, but they cannot replace strong legislations. It cannot replace implementation, which are the responsibility of the state. So we must always keep that in mind when, for every criticism, there is a Dubai Expo welfare standards thrown at our face or a Supreme Committee welfare standards thrown at our face. It's very important to recognize that those are just standards. It is rather disturbing and of great concern that well-intentioned but non-binding measures are being mainstreamed as the norm across the GCC, not just with businesses, but also in regional and global processes. GCC states are so eager to participate in a GCM or a GFMD or Abu Dhabi Dialogue or Colombo process more than they would in a binding UN mechanism. They'll create pilot projects that don't really shake or question the status quo domestically. So you'll see these things that come up, and the fear is that it will be normalized, not just normalized, but there will not be any room for sustainable changes within these countries, that you'll end up seeing too many bilateral discussions between two countries and standards applying only for those citizens, which is then determined by how powerful the origin country is and not by how committed the destination country is. So we need to, again, look at what are these processes, what are these different conversations that are taking the main stage, where we are not talking about the human rights of labor migrants, but we are very narrowly talking about labor management, right? As Fabian mentioned, the whole thing is about temporary or guest, but the fact is dependency on migrants is permanent. There's no way around it. Fertility rates are dropping. These economies are still growing, so their dependence is never going to go away. So we shouldn't, again, just accept that term of workers being temporary or guest. We also need to see that all these non-binding processes, the welfare standards, all of these things kind of solidify the relationship between the employer and the employee to the benefit of the former primarily. But what is the relationship between the resident and the state? What is the state's obligation? That question, again, is something we need to always put forward. It's not always the employer. It shouldn't always be the employer's responsibility. The state must govern both. These are all the things that the kafala system as a whole has managed to, keep at bay these questions, because we only look at reforming certain laws and say certain labor codes. During the discussions, we will of course explore further, but I'll stop here and hand over to my colleague Ali.
Hello all, I'm Ali Mohammed from Bahrain, and I'm the Arabic content editor in Migrant Rights. So before, I'm going to speak about the role of citizens within all the things that we discussed, being a citizen myself. But just before that, I want to start by saying that, when criticizing Kafala, I think it's important to focus on structure and not culture. Like Kafala isn't necessarily, as Fabian mentioned, is like it comes from a certain historical process, and it's not something that's specifically, Khaliji or Arab, and it's also not exceptional in a sense that it's a form of temporary labor migration system that we can find in other countries as well. Although in the Gulf, it's like on a different, larger scale. So I want to say that, like Vani spoke about who benefits from the kafala, and I'll be short, and I'll just gonna say who doesn't benefit from kafala. And of course, we know that migrants don't benefit, right? But I want to make the point that citizens don't benefit from kafala, working class citizens. And specifically, I want to say that countries on the long term and on macro level and economies don't benefit from kafala. And it's important for local citizens to acknowledge that, kafala plays a major role in making the private sector, making themselves less demand in the private sector, and keeping the conditions of private sector exploitative and unattractive. And Van discussed how there is a drive towards diversification and privatization, pushing more locals into the private sector. And how can you do that when companies can have the control under the kafala system to dispose, to deport workers, to keep the conditions exploitative? So for large number of, context differs, but I come from Bahrain, and we have a lot of issues of unemployment among the youth citizens. And unfortunately, often and during moments of crisis, there are segments in the population that use xenophobic narratives to make it an issue or to point fingers at the migrant and not at the system, at the kafala system. So it's when in order to improve the conditions of the private sector, I think to ensure that workers can stay, have a legal stay in the country regardless of unemployment, which essentially means abolishing kafala. And another thing I think is important for informed citizens in the region to kind of use their privilege to speak up and amplify the voices of migrant workers. Migrant workers, they don't have the privilege to unionize in a lot of places. They don't have privilege to speak up. And that's when I think someone like me or any other citizen who is not deportable can work towards changing the system. And granted, we don't live in democratic states, but still, I think there's much we can do. In some countries where there are unions, unfortunately, because of this lack of push towards inclusivity, we don't see much of work being done to bring migrant workers in that and have a recognition that migrant workers' rights and local citizens are inextricable, they're inseparable, you know. So yeah, so and like in terms of like how it could benefit also like those who on short term think they could benefit by, you know, having exploitative migrants, they can we can have a look at recent example during COVID, where, you know, decades of legalized segregation enabled by Kafala have caused havoc. Like we couldn't have a proper like methods to deal with the COVID crisis and other crises. So I just want to keep it there, and I raised the question where what can we do when a significant part of the population are employers, you know, and they kind of on short-term benefit from Kafala. How can we change that? And I'm gonna leave it at there.
Great, thank you so much, Rima, Bani, and Ali, for those really valuable introductions. I think, as I said at the beginning, we just proving again that migrant.org has a wealth of knowledge and experience, and there's so much we can dive into now. So what we're going to do is have a kind of curated discussion for the next 35 minutes or so before drawing on some of the questions that have come through from the Q&A. So just to kick off, one of the first, you know, we've spoken at length already about the nature of the different kind of variations of the Kafala system, and also, you know, we've spoken about the situations, who benefits, and the situations that migrant workers can find themselves in. I often think that for migrant workers, essentially, I think of it almost as a lottery, that too often there's too much of a lottery in terms of whether or not migrant workers can just earn their wages and you know, perform their job without falling into significant crisis, and there's not enough kind of security. But I wanted to dive into a bit more about how those kind of situations actually come about. So it's a question I'm going to post to the group, but maybe Rima, if you could lead the answer to it, I think. Essentially, can you explain or expand a bit more about how Kafala actually facilitates some of the worst situations we see, like to do with forced labor, essentially involuntary working, and for everyone in this discussion as well, if we can think about how the Kafala system also facilitates those dynamics, or those issues, in particularly a gendered lens as well. We touched on different industries. So yeah, Rima, if you have any initial thoughts, and then if anyone else wants to come in on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really great question to start with. We actually have this interactive infographic that we did a couple of years ago now, but it's sadly still very relevant. I will drop a link to it in the chat box, and it really sort of puts you in the shoes of a worker who, you know, is under the Kafala system and is having trouble leaving an abusive employment situation. So, I mean, of course, when your visa is tied to an employer and you can't easily change jobs without their permission, you don't have a lot of bargaining power. And let's say you invested a lot to come into the region, you might have, you know, sold your land to do it. You don't really have the option of returning home, and you become compelled to do this job that you don't want to do, or, you know, whose conditions are different from, you know, what you were promised. Some of the Gulf states have recently relaxed provisions for changing employment without employers' permission, but, you know, with the recent exception of Qatar, you still generally have to wait 1 to 2 years before you can transfer without permission. And even then, the process isn't as easy as it looks like on paper. And since most of these, you know, reforms weren't designed with workers in mind, navigating the system becomes really difficult, even if you do have the law on your side. I think this is especially the case with workers who, you know, are suffering abuse, or who haven't had their wages paid for, you know, 3 months, which is in itself a form of abuse. So in these cases, in most countries, you know, they don't need an employer's permission to change jobs, but they still have to go through the complaints process. They still have the burden of proof is on them, and they independently have to figure out how to navigate all of this. So dealing with a system that's in a language they might not understand, requiring resources like time and taxi money that they don't have, And then, in a country where it makes it very difficult to, have a vibrant civil society that could be there to support migrant workers. And I mean, we could have a whole separate webinar on how faulty complaint systems are, but it's just to show, as you said, where if you don't hit the lottery and get a good employer, then you become stuck in this, stuck in this position that you can't get out of. And the way, it's interesting because Kafala essentially applies to all migrant workers of all different statuses who come to the region. But of course, the way that a white male banker experiences Kafala is going to be very different from the way that an Ethiopian domestic worker experiences it. And it's not only because there are now in several countries like different categories of workers. So for some, highly skilled workers, it's easier to change your job after, say, 3 or 6 months. Rather than maybe 2 years for a domestic worker. But it's because, domestic work, one, it's a highly feminized sector, of course, and it's so often a sector that is excluded from these Kafala reforms. So there's a really good side-by-side comparison that we have between domestic workers laws and workers who fall under the labor law. And there are very different conditions for, changing jobs, both with or without the permission of your employer. And because they are, often stuck at home, their mobility is heavily restricted. The power that an employer has over them is just furthermore compounded. I will leave it there to allow, Vani and Ali to also add.
So much, Rina. Ali, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to add to the point that how, like, economically it's irrational. Like the fact that you, like in some countries, just an example, like in Kuwait, like even with the consent of an employer, a worker has to work at least for a year to be able to change jobs. That means like for a business in Kuwait or like other countries as well who have similar restrictions. Like they have to look outside of the country to like hire a worker instead of like tapping into the domestic pool. So it's like it kind of doesn't make even like a kind of economic sense, like these restrictions on mobility. And I just want to add that.
Yeah, I completely agree, and hopefully we can like delve in. I think in one of the later questions, maybe around, you emphasized it in your introduction. I think we should discuss a bit just the fact that this is not just an imposition on job mobility, but also the development of a kind of flexible mobile labor market as well. So we'll definitely discuss that, I think, a bit later on in the session. But Vani, did you want to add to this particular point on forced labor as well?
Yeah, just to remind ourselves as well that when we're saying, does Kafala facilitate, again, it may sound like Kafala is one thing. It's like one set of laws, which it isn't. The composite of laws facilitates forced labor. Like we've mentioned before, that the absconding charges are still there in Qatar. So on paper, it's very easy for you to change jobs, but so you can go to the Labor Department and get it done. But the minute the absconding charges are filed, then you're running between ministries to get your work done, to clear the case against you. And for women, this becomes even more difficult, especially women domestic workers, because they don't have access to cheap or free public transport. They need money, and the minute they step out of the household, they can be reported as absconding. So we need to also look at how these countries are set up. If the majority of your population are lower income migrant workers, but your public services don't address their needs, where you don't have a decent shelter, where you don't have decent public transport, what kind of a life are you envisioning for them, even if they are temporary? I think that is something we need to consider, because that's one way of challenging this whole idea of abolishing kafala equals rights of everyone living there.
Yeah, I think just before we moved on to the next question, I think, Vani, you're absolutely right. There are so many other elements, and I think we do have a question coming up that is kafala solely to blame for labor abuse? And I think we all agree that's not the case. So when I'm thinking about the issue of labor abuse in the GCC in particular, there's, we've touched on accountability and the absence of it, and the absence of kind of meaningful and accessible, timely remedy as well. So I think we need to look at how the existing labor protections that actually may exist, for example, in national labor laws, are not actually implemented or applied, and how that actually significantly exacerbates the scale of labor abuse. I think just my final thoughts on this question around forced labor is always, and if you take the elements of forced labor in terms of involuntary work as a result of a threat or a penalty, and when you tie that kind of formula with essentially the controls that an employer has or a sponsor has, it just kind of, there are so many kind of ways in which that kind of scenario can come about in terms of control over the worker's ability to actually change jobs, a threat of saying, well, actually, no, if you try to change jobs, then there'll be some sort of retaliation. Vanna, you mentioned especially absconding, which I think is a crucial element of the Kafala system, as you said, because essentially that is a retaliatory or potential retaliatory power which all sponsors essentially have over migrant workers, that can result in them either being detained or deported, and that workers are obviously well aware that that's a risk that they face in terms of if they challenge their employer, if they try to push for better employment, for example. So I think that when we look at the harshest elements of the various forms of the Kafala systems, I think that when I try to judge whether reforms are really bringing about meaningful change for migrants, I'm always, one of the first things I'm looking at is whether the employer still has these kind of tools to essentially threaten a worker or to essentially punish a worker, and creating an involuntary working situation where they otherwise would leave, but otherwise because of these kind of this power which is wielded, they have to essentially stay in a situation that they would otherwise exit. And also the worker's actual ability to extract themselves from an abusive labor situation. Rima, you mentioned the complaints process, and so I wanted to kind of build on that a bit in terms of trying to understand. So when we think of Kafala, variations of this system, sometimes you hear it talked about as if it is a system which is being abused, which is definitely the case. And so I wanted to throw it out to all of you in terms of, do you see, when you think of Kafala, do you think of an abusive system or a system which is being abused by unscrupulous employers, for example? And so connected to that, do you think, can Kafala essentially be managed? Can we eliminate worker abuse by managing it better? For example, by having quicker, more meaningful complaints processes and remedy processes? Does that outweigh the power that employers have? Or do we really need to be talking about abolition, as is in the title of this event? So who wanted to come in on that first? Ali, I think
I can go ahead. I think both. Like, we can argue for removing the worst elements of Kafala, while also like having the vision to completely abolish it. But given that completely abolishing it, like given how Kafala is so central to the structure of Gulf societies and has a huge scale, like we're not talking about abolishing temporary foreign worker programs in Canada, for example, where few like a tiny portion of the private sector is. We're talking about the whole thing. So since we're not there yet, we can argue that we can push for changing the worst elements of it, which frankly on personal level, like it does make a difference. It does make a difference that a migrant worker can leave the country without needing permission from the employer. And when different Gulf countries implemented that, or like the condition of changing the employment after working certain years, yes, it on personal level it helps, and I think we should have that. But on what we need in the future to think about is to how to restructure the whole system, that privileges some citizens over others, and kind of have the state implement and enforce inclusive political and economic rights for everyone, including non-citizens. So yeah, we must abolish this organization of difference through citizenship, race, gender, that is kind of enabled by Kafala.
Thanks, Ali. Just to quickly, you mentioned Canada, so I'll just take advantage of the fact that in the 5 Corridors project that I'm actually working on with First Go Projects, Canada is one of the countries which we're assessing how recruitment takes place between Mexico and Canada, and the role of kind of temporary single-tide visa and whether that does actually exacerbate abuse. So I think that's a kind of connection between all, like you said, single employer tied visas and whether they actually increase risks of abuse. I think that yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned Canada, because there is definitely attention on these kind of visas, but in other forums, in other jurisdictions as well. But Vani, Rima, did you want to comment on this question of abusive or abused system and managed or abolish?
Yeah. Can I want to address it from one of the questions I see from Alex, who says, even the EU has a legal framework which ties residence permit to the employers, that only EU nationals can renew it themselves, which is true. But again, what is the dependency on migrant labor there? That's one question to ask. And the other is, what we're seeing in Qatar is a lot of companies, not Qatar, across the Gulf, is that a lot of companies uses renewal as a stick, right? That they could easily not renew the work visa. And in some of the countries, at least in earlier things, that means that they're not in the WPS system anymore. Their wages cannot be monitored. And the other thing that happens is when the visa is extended without the worker's approval, like in the case of domestic workers, you just renew the visa, the worker has no say in it. Then you say, okay, your contract has been extended, we paid for a year, and this can't happen. So yes, I think we need to look at what are the recommendations that Alex is asking for to ensure that any renewal happens either like where the worker is able to take their work contract and go get it renewed themselves. Of course, the fees have to be billed to not reimbursed, but billed to the employer, because all these systems are linked financially. So either the worker goes and renews it with their work permit, or if the employer is doing it, then it cannot be done without the worker's presence. This is a simple solution to ensure that everybody is aware of the contract that they're signing, even for renewal. And then also look at the fact that there's such a dependency. You need a model of employment that is not purely temporary. Ali will speak later about one scheme that is there in Bahrain, but there has been no real effort to see what other alternatives could work for the region. You have certain visa regimes within free zones. Again, this is something we need to recognize, right? You have Qatar and the UAE, which have Qatar has, I think, one big free zone, which is QFC, but UAE has so many, and they all have different kinds of visa regimes. In some cases, allowing for a lot more freedom for workers, in some cases, allowing for far less. So I think that needs to be studied.
Thanks, Vani. Rima, did you want to come in as well here?
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, at first, I think the way that you phrased the question is really interesting. And it goes back to sort of what Vani mentioned about being careful not to blur all of the labor and rights issues that do occur into the region under the Kafala system. Because if we fall into this idea that all we need to do is abolish the Kafala and everything will be resolved, we're still going to be a very unpretty situation. And I think that's why when we do see these, attempted reforms to the system, to the NOCs, they don't work because the rest of the system also doesn't work. So whether it's recruitment, whether it's complaints mechanisms, I think we think of Kafala as sort of the symbol for how migrant workers are treated in the region, but really it's sort of essence is in everything, right? It's in the culture of bureaucracy and a culture of administration and the way people treat each other. So there's so many other things that would need to be reformed. And I agree with Ali in that, you know, it's not that we need to, you know, poo-poo on all small reforms that come up. I think there's a big realization that, you know, the kafala is a paradigm and it's not going to change overnight. And that these reforms do represent really important, can potentially be very important for migrant workers if they are implemented. And that's why when we see a change, we need to ensure that there aren't a million other obstacles that are added somewhere down the road. Yeah.
Thanks, Rima. Based on that response and the way that the way that those responses kind of came about, I think I might just jump ahead to another question that we had actually, which is exactly kind of picking up on what Rima was just saying. You know, is Kafala solely to blame? I think we can agree that everyone on this discussion does not think, you know, it doesn't take that reductive approach. So can I call on Ali? Do you mind, can you just tell us a bit, run through a bit more about what are the other kind of labor abuses and patterns and labor issues that we see which exacerbate some of the risks that where kafala may underpin some of the driving dynamics, but yeah, what are the other kind of issues to blame for labor abuse beyond specifically the sponsorship systems?
I mean, they intersect, the kafala and the labor issue, of course, but there are actually a lot of things that are not necessarily, you know, to blame, takes the blame for kafala per se. Like there are several things that could be reformed without, you know, abolishing kafala, as we mentioned. Like something as simple like having a minimum wage, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, a kafala issue. Like having a livable wage is, you know, that every migrant can, you know, benefit from, or like other things that are even in the law but they are not enforced. You know, the lack of enforcement, lack of accountability, you know, it does intersect with kafala and, you know, exclusionary citizenship, but still they are on their own. There are different things that, you know, we can be changed, and we citizens and non-citizens should fight for those. You know, if we cannot change the whole kafala system, we should start, you know, saying, you know, okay, minimum wage, other human rights issues that, you know, it's not necessarily tied to kafala per se.
Thanks, Ali. Vani, Rima, would you like to expand on some of the range of labor issues that intersect, as Ali said, with kafala?
I think there's a question here on wage theft in kafala. Because we so closely link a worker's residence with the work permit, the reason that that needs to be a bit of separation is, if I as a worker files a complaint against my employer for not paying me when I'm still working, then even the place I'm living in is under jeopardy. I'm going to become homeless. I'm going to be thrown out, right? So these are the different links that we're looking at. And Ali mentioned minimum wage. So, and there's also a question related to minimum wage in the chat box about ILO's, the Qatar minimum wage. While it is a good move, 2 countries in the Gulf have a minimum wage. Kuwait, it's different for domestic workers and private sector workers, visa 18 and visa 20 and visa 18. In Qatar, it's non-discriminatory, but these wages are still very, very low. I know in the areas where most of the construction is happening, I'm giving you an example, where the construction is happening is Daphna in West Bay area. The cheapest tea shop there, if I want to have a snack, I'll have to pay 5 riyals. That's the cheapest one. I'll probably have to walk 5-6 kilometers for that tea shop. And that's a treat for me, right, as a worker. And if your minimum wage itself is just 1,000 riyals, your basic wage, then you're kind of telling them, here's what you're going to earn for your, just about cover your labor and to send money home, but not to have any kind of a real life in the country that you're building. So what messages are we sending out when we keep the bar that low in terms of minimum wage. Is that related to Kafala? I don't know, but it all seems to link back to that one thing. So I think we need to really start looking at when a migrant worker comes in, even for a 2-year contract, what is their quality of life in that country? And what is the quality of life for their families back home who are dependent on it? Does one have to sacrifice for the other to have a decent life? And is that fair? I think that's something that we really need to.
Thank you, Vani. Rima, did you want to add to this discussion about additional kind of abusive elements beyond Kafala, or how they intersect with Kafala?
Yeah, just briefly, because I think Bonnie and Adi kind of captured most of it. But one thing that I always think about is recruitment, because recruitment is this sphere where we often see countries of destination trying to displace accountability for issues migrant workers face. It's this idea that, you signed this false contract over there, the recruiter charged you money over there, without this realization that it's not, it's a continuous thing, and that this, this ability for them to do what they're doing in origin countries wouldn't exist if these issues did not exist in destination, and that no matter what happens to them in origin, you could have the best recruitment experience in origin, and then once you set foot into the Gulf states, as you said, it's a what's it called, a draw of the card, like, I'm mixing up my my things, but it just depends on who you get. It depends on who you get, and so that's always the example that comes to mind when I think of intersection. But I think the points that Ali and Bonnie raised about about the importance of seeing a worker as more than just labor, right? He's a person who lives there, and the way that the kafala makes it very difficult for you as a low-income worker to sort of live a full and real life, and how I think sometimes when we're speaking about the kafala, we restrict ourselves to conversations about about wages and about working hours, and not necessarily about social rights. So
yeah, I think that's so right, but there's always a risk when we only base this discussion around labor rights, and especially when we use essentially forced labor as the metric, that we're starting with a really low bar and not really thinking about kind of emancipatory frameworks. I think just one final point I would make just on this issue of like the other kind of forms of labor abuse that you've all highlighted, which intersect with kafala, like the way that we can see that actually the existing protections that may be there in labor laws aren't being forced, is also just that issue of accountability, which I think keeps coming up as well. Wage theft, that is largely outlawed in every labor law in most of the countries talking about. Employers have a responsibility under law to pay their workers on time. As you highlighted, the minimum wage being coming into effect yesterday in Qatar and in one other GCC country as well. And then, also passport confiscation is outlawed in, I think, every single GCC state now, but it's still a common practice. And I think that one of the reasons that tied to that is the absence of accountability as well. So I think that when employers are never really when the law isn't applied to employers, that I think that intersects a lot with the power that that sponsors and employers get from the kafala system. So we've spoken about some of the the kind of very real lived experiences of workers and how the kafala system plays out. We're obviously talking a lot about reform as well. So I wanted to kind of dive into some of these kind of the narratives and the politics of reform a little bit as well. So as I said, I think almost every GCC state has introduced some form of reform over the past 10 years at least. Different scales of ambition, different scales of focus as well. I think we've all heard that kafala has been abolished quite a number of times, sometimes in the same country saying they've abolished it, and then a few years later introducing another law which goes further, but kind of suggests that they hadn't abolished it a few years before. So I guess my question is about the politics of this. Why do we see some countries perhaps overselling the scale of the reforms, and do we ever see any governments essentially justify or defend the merits of the system as they see it and argue for a more kind of, you know, set out a measured kind of trajectory. It seems to either, to me, it seems that either certain governments don't really talk about reform, and then others talk at great length, and somewhere in between you have the reality for workers. So yeah, is there anyone who'd like to come in on that, on just on the narrative around reform and the potential disconnect as well from immediate realities?
Yeah. I'm going to start by answering a question that Hari Krishna from Kuwait said, that in Kuwait, we don't have a kafala system. And I think that's the whole idea for the seminar. There is a kafala system in all of the countries, right? But because they don't use the term. We've seen 3 countries in the Gulf really pushing back and saying, we're going to abolish, we're going to reform. And those 3 countries are, of course, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi, that have reputation management. They've had big events. Bahrain wants to protect its tip status, tier 1 status. Saudi wants to protect everything. Qatar wants to host the World Cup. So these are the countries that will keep saying these things, that we don't have kafala, or that we think. And I know Rima, just before the webinar, told me that Kuwait also put this out in 2011 saying that they were abolishing kafala, and then went back and said, we're going to reform it. I think the reasons that the Gulf countries don't defend the kafala and keep talking about reforming it is it suits them. It suits them to talk about kafala as being something that the employer is misusing the system, and we'll try to put some checks and balances in place. But there are no checks and balances for the employer. They're never held accountable. So I think it just suits these countries very well politically to speak about kafala, because if you were to replace kafala with another argument, advocacy argument, that is human rights of every person living there, citizens and residents. So you can't expect migrant women to have rights or to have access to justice systems that citizen women themselves don't have, right? You can't expect freedom for migrant workers in general when citizens themselves can't unionize. So they want to like clearly avoid that about what is the human rights environment in these countries, and make it about kafala that talks about a narrow thing so they can address those criticisms. They can keep changing policies every now and then to suit that criticism. So we need to then probably, all of us, and this is not, I'm not blaming someone outside. Sometimes MR itself falls under this trap of speaking only about this kafala, but we need to push for something more. We need to question why millions of workers live for 10, 15, 20 years in the Gulf countries separated from their families, that they can't afford to go back home more than once in 4 or 5 years, if at all. How that is a basic human right that's being denied to them. But all of those things will not fit into the kafala narrative. So it's easier for them to just talk about kafala as a labor management system and respond to that, then look at the overall. I know I'm sounding extremely cynical, but it's just a little frustrating because you see repeatedly countries getting away with whatever they're doing. And we're also seeing an increasing trend of global dialogues, regional dialogues, accepting this as a norm instead of questioning and pushing them. Some good exceptions have been the special rapporteur, the special procedures of the UN, which have gone beyond their call of duty to question these systems, which is great. They talk about race, xenophobia, poverty of migrants. But in general, you see that the global discourse is saying, okay, you want to talk only about these problems, we will cater to that. I think that's the...
Excellent, thanks so much, Rani. I didn't think you were being cynical, but I'm going to call on Rima now, if you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, largely the same, unfortunately. I mean, I look at examples like, Bahrain, and how so much of what they have done seems largely to be driven in response to, you know, the tip reports, and then to accolades, and then just very much wanting to conserve this image of them being, you know, the best country in the world, in the Gulf region, which is a perception a lot of people have when they actually have some of the worst the worst legislations for migrant workers and for domestic workers especially. So I think we can't you know, understate how important PR and public image is to these states. And I think, you know, as Vani said, what this accomplishes is that, or, you know, also what you said yesterday, is it puts things on the agenda, right? So if we say that it needs to be Kafala that's reformed, they'll reform Kafala and then not really expect anybody to follow up and see, okay, maybe what other parallel systems have been designed to ensure that actually, you know, employers still do have a lot of control over workers, which is what we've seen in every succeeding reform. And I think, you know, after like the Qatar crisis, especially, that's when we saw the GCC states just being really in competition with each other. And I'm using a phrase that, you know, I think I heard from Bonnie, which is, you know, competing to look the best, competing to be the best. But again, that only goes so far. And I have more to say on this, but I think I'll save it for one of the questions that's coming up. So.
Thanks, Rima. Ali, did you have anything to add on the kind of narratives around reform?
I don't have much to add to what Rima and Vani said, but I'll just add this, that it's kind of a shame that like Gulf governments look towards like look for PR points to kind of engage in any reforms, even though they might not be enforced or affected. The fact that civil society, progressive civil society, or even migrants themselves are not included in any of these, you know, development of these reforms, or even asked about whether how this reform will help or how they can contribute. The fact that it's just, you know, migrants and citizens not having agency over, you know, what reforms should look like, I think it's something to think about.
Thank you, Ali. I think for the last, I'm going to try and merge some of the questions from the remainder of the curated discussion so we can try to incorporate. I know that the panelists have been incorporating some of the questions that are coming through already. I'm just going to try and merge two questions that discussion points we had as well. So we've talked about government narratives around reform. I wanted to discuss a bit around private sector narratives as well. We have sometimes seen chambers of commerce or private sector representatives sometimes show resistance to reforms. So I wanted to ask you, are some of those, is some of the resistance justified? Do they have a point in some ways around their own commercial interests, for example? And maybe I'll connect that with some of the discussion we wanted to have just around feminized sectors as well. Obviously, employers of domestic workers, we do sometimes see like quite prominent, you know, op-eds in certain newspapers, like representing the interests of employers of domestic workers. So again, could we discuss maybe a bit about resistance to reforms from private sector and employers of domestic workers, and, you know, to what extent do they have a point? Are they justified, and or in what case actually are they not valid, essentially? Vani, can I call on you first for that one?
Sure. When we've done a lot of advocacy and roundtables and discussions with businesses, primarily in Qatar, a little bit in Kuwait, and remotely in Saudi and the UAE. So you need to look at the scale of businesses, what kind of projects they have, and how a business that sees ethical recruitment, ethical employment paying off will continue to do that. And those that don't see it pay off will not do it, right? Why is there a pushback? There are a couple of things that we need to look at. Which are the companies that are pushing back? What is the kind of concerns they have? In the case of Qatar reforms, if you take particularly, the pushback was because the reforms, in one very, very small part, was because the reforms were announced at the height of the pandemic, where overseas recruitment wasn't possible. and businesses were already poorly affected. They were not making money, they were running into losses. Even though there was a state hand, you could take a loan from the bank, businesses were not opting for that because they were not aware of what's going to happen, how they'll be able to pay back. It was easier for them just not to pay the workers. In that circumstance, you brought in the reforms and they probably panicked and pushed back. That's one part, definitely recognize that issue. But the other part is, what kind of a business model do you have if you feel the only way you can operate is forcing workers who are not happy working for you to continue working, to insist that workers work for less than what their market rate is? Is this something that you would do? If you are a professional skilled worker, wouldn't you want to have a competitive environment? I've heard said that, oh, but workers are changing for 100 riyals or 50 riyals more. That actually reflects poorly on you as a business, not them as a worker, because that 100 riyal makes a difference because the salary was so low to begin with. So what is the business plan? How easy is it for you to set up when I say you, keeping in mind that it's not always managed by citizens. There is always another, probably a better paid migrant who is managing it, aware of all of that. So when I say you, I'm talking about the private sector as a whole. Is it easier to set up a business than it is to run? What due diligence do you take? Like, how many cafes does one city need? How many cupcake factories? How many resin production factories does one country need? Is it easier to set up the business than to run it and to find clients? We've seen a lot of this happening. We saw when the Gulf blockade happened, the whole idea was, okay, Qatar was isolated, but there was a lot of rejuvenation of local businesses who had to step in and provide services. Yes, I mean, that made sense, but are you competitive beyond the blockade? And we've seen this in the UAE. Like, UAE has all these free zones, which makes it so easy for anyone to start a business. So I think we need to, like, yeah, sometimes there is a concern, but what are they protesting? They're protesting a worker's right to change jobs, to get their salaries. I mean, this is quite, these are not conditions in which they themselves would work. Just to keep that bit in mind in terms of private sector. And the other one that I want to talk about is, to my mind, the private sector concerns are more linked to the liquidity in the market and payments than it is linked to the workers themselves. The fact that businesses don't get paid on time or what was promised, and that has a ripple effect on workers, must be recognized. And also the fact that the biggest projects are the ones that are funded by the government or quasi-governmental organizations. So if you follow the money, you will realize a lot of the non-payment will go directly back to the government. But the private sector businesses don't want to question that, but they will question this. So, I mean, how does all of this come up? And because you look at the migrant labor as a very cheap labor, and hence they're dispensable, any right or privilege extended to them seems like too much.
Thanks, Fanny. And I'll just ask if either Rima or Ali wanted to add to that, because I'm going to try and start incorporating more and more questions that have either been sent through in advance during registration or that have come through in the Q&A. So either or, Rima, Ali, did you want to add to that?
Just like one sentence briefly, I just think it brings up a really important dimension that we often don't consider with these reforms, which is that you do need buy-in from these important groups. Like, I mean, they're not full democratic countries, sure, but they still need this buy-in. And I think we don't think of that sometimes when we are doing our own advocacy. When I say we, I mean also us, at MR or anybody. And I think there was a question from the Q&A about, how do you get this buy-in? And it's a trick question, actually, because we've tried it, and it's a very delicate balance between sort of not trying to create, a parallel separate structure amongst, businesses that is, different from what should ideally be, the rule of law, and then trying to sort of convince people that this can actually, work in your benefit. And I think, there's been numerous reports, conducted by states themselves, consultants for the states themselves, which, have proven that the sponsorship system curtails competitiveness, and it's bad for wages, it's bad for productivity. But it's so hard to undermine sort of this idea that we need control over workers in order for for our businesses to be successful. Sorry, that was more than a sentence.
No, that was really crucial. I think that's an important context, and like you said, almost a dilemma in advocacy as well. This is drawn from a few of the questions that we received. So Ali, I was going to call on you to particularly address this. Is specifically around benchmarks. So a lot of people asking about benchmarks and reforms. What examples do exist? Essentially, I guess, moving towards best practice. And I'm going to link it as well for others to join in as well, just around the question of lessons learned, in particular from Qatar's reforms. I think, we all agree that, I'm assuming that we all agree that the NOC reform was, particularly significant, and, something that needs to be protected going forward. So Ali, do you mind talking about what you consider to be some important benchmarks in terms of reforms that you're familiar with as well, and then if others want to come in just around the issue of what lessons learned from Qatar's reform process as well?
Sure. I wouldn't call it maybe a benchmark, but it's definitely something new when what Bahrain has done, which is the flexi permit. Basically, it gives the chance for a low-income migrant worker to self-sponsor, and it delinks the tie that we were discussing to be problematic between employer and the worker. It is a step in the right direction. A migrant worker has the mobility, he's in control of his residency. But at the same time, it is problematic in a sense that, and it's like a lesson to be learned that, delinking is not enough, because basically what we're doing is that with flexi is the state is becoming a sort of sponsor. If you don't pay the fees for the flexi, you're deported, or if you have done any sort of petty crime or whatever, if you're working in a wrong profession, you're deported. So this is where access to this is where citizenship comes into play. And like what we were talking about, how it's not just kafala, it's access to welfare. Like flexi workers are, because they don't have a sponsor, they are responsible for everything, their housing, their food, or tickets, or whatever that was on the sponsor was responsible for. So this shows like how when there is no that is just abolishing kafala is not enough, and we also need within it access to welfare, which entails access to citizenship, and to have for a social well for these workers.
Thanks, Ali. And does anyone want to reflect on lessons learned from Qatar's very kind of high-profile reform process as well?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been these are really, really important reforms. The fact that you can change your jobs at any point of your contract. The minimum wage in itself is good, but I'm not a fan of the figure. I really think it's too low. It's lower than what some countries have decided bilaterally. But the NOC, removal of NOC and removal of exit permit are really important developments. The lesson learned is, of course, that Qatar itself is going to benefit in terms of international standards. I know that there are people within Qatar who are being trained in this, so it's not always a dependency on people from the outside, from consultants to come in. That has been the trend. So they are developing a pool of people locally who know these systems, who know these international labor standards. All of these things are really great. What it should be accompanied by is implementation and accountability. And it is really too early to criticize, even though I've been criticizing it. But I don't look at it as criticism. It's a question of monitoring the situation. But the fact is the implementation has been really poor. And ever since there's been a pushback from the businesses, from QCCI to begin with, but then from the Shura Council, we are seeing that the process, which on paper is so simple that you don't need to even talk to your employer, has become so wrought with confusion, harassment, people not really supporting the workers. And these could very well be teething pains, and that this might change and you will have stronger mechanisms. That's the hope, but I will not celebrate as yet.
That seems like a very fair assessment. So I'm going to merge some questions. So we wanted to discuss a bit about how, actually, sorry, there was a question about this in the Q&A, just around sending governments as well, origin countries, how governments from origin countries engage with the Kafala system and the reform process. And I might just link that as well to a question that I can see, which is about, the question asks, like, what's the power of non-citizens to create dialogue, I guess, around reform and around labor rights? I'm assuming they mean in the destination country, and they kind of flag, especially within the context where there may not be that much solidarity from kind of professionals within their companies who obviously experience Kafala in a very similar way. So the question is both about sending governments and their engagement with the reform process, but also about citizens of labor sending governments, how they can mobilize, can they mobilize in the destination country? And I'll leave that open to any of the three panelists to comment.
Very quickly about sending countries, I think they shouldn't so much focus on the Kafala as what are the, because there's only, sending countries really don't have any power in destination countries. We must recognize it. They can keep systems in place for their citizens, which to a degree Philippines does do. But if you take one of the largest sending countries in the world, not just Gulf, to anywhere, India, they have so few labor attaches, which means even though there's exporting labor, their labor ministry itself is not involved in that export of labor or in providing services for the workers the way Philippines does. So to consider all of those facts, to make sure that there are transnational mechanisms, especially for wage theft. This is a campaign that the coalition MFA has been running to make sure that origin countries come up with solutions for wage theft. I think we must look at it from that, but always recognize that the onus lies on destination countries. And quickly about non-citizens, I think Ali will speak a bit more, but there are a couple of countries, like if you look at Kuwait and Bahrain, there are non-citizens, especially in Kuwait, non-citizens involved in civil society groups who speak up. And strangely, despite everything else that happens in Kuwait, that some of them have an open line with the ministry, with the officials, and are able to do really meaningful work within Kuwait. We are seeing something like that in Qatar with community groups. Initially, it was under the NHRC, but now we see that, if I'm not mistaken, under one of the unions, community liaison officers. But again, they look at their own sectors. This is good because otherwise it's restricted to groups registered with the ministries, working very narrowly only on their own citizens' cause. But what we really need is a room for more civil society activism without fear of being deported or criminalized for it.
Thanks, Vani. Ali, did you want to add to that as well?
I would just want to comment on the role of civil society and specifically unions in countries that exist. I mean, there are 3 countries that allow for unions, in a sense of unions, and that's Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. And in Kuwait, unfortunately, migrant workers are not on top of their priority. Similar in Oman is like on another scale, but in Bahrain, there are some initiative, but that required like push from citizens and non-citizens and international organizations to kind of push that. But unfortunately, I mean, and to be fair to the unions, they are dealing in a restrictive environment. You know, there's in Bahrain specifically, they're not on, you know, the best terms since 2011 with the government. So there's that. But that being said, there's still a lot of potential for in certain countries to push the unions for the unions to push for, you know, better conditions for migrant workers. And as I said before, it is so essential to recognize that, you know, the rights of migrant workers and citizen workers are one of the same if we want to improve the conditions of the labor market. And another thing that is essential is, given how, you know, how the nature of workforce is temporary and it's so like globalized, it also entails that what unions, whatever their capacity, they have to connect with the unions in the sending countries and, you know, form strategies on that. So that's all I want to say.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, I think the strategic approaches and transnational kind of engagement is crucial. I just want to flag, like, which I think is a really important point that I can see Dr. Ray Giardini has mentioned a few times, that a lot of some of the reforms which are introduced in different countries are often kind of tied to fees as well that a worker may have to pay to actually access those reforms. So I just wanted to flag that as when we were talking about exclusions earlier. So there's exclusions in terms of coverage, in terms of certain industries which are predominantly occupied by women may be excluded from reforms, but also that maybe reforms may not be accessible as well if you have to pay a certain fee to access a particular flexibility, or if there's a salary level also that needs to be actually earned, which is way beyond the scope that most low-income, low-paid workers in the GCC are actually earning. So I wanted to draw on a question which was asking about international law and tie it maybe to a discussion we were having recently just about governance as well. So Rima, so the question was about is international law a source of pressure and mobilization for the reform processes? And so I was just going to also tie that, as I said, with some of the discussion we were having about how does Kafala sit in some of the emerging or dominant discourses around migration governance, kind of globally, internationally, or regionally as well. So Rima, do you want to tackle that? Rima, you're still on mute.
Okay. No, I think there are kind of two answers to that question. I mean, so we've had really good success in engagement through UN mechanisms and in tabling issues on the region to special rapporteurs or to treaty bodies, and having that sort of light shed on these issues in such a public space has been really important for getting governments to at least respond. At the same time, and I think there are probably a lot of people that would disagree with me, but I think that the engagement that I've seen with like these new processes and stuff has been very perfunctory. So, and their engagement in them, just their engagement alone is applauded as a sign of progress. And I think that's a really low benchmark to set. So, while we see increasing like cooperation with UN organizations, which is important, and like a louder presence by some of these states in these spaces, I think the problem is exactly that it's the states themselves that are dominating these spaces and controlling the narrative, and they're not challenged. With very few exceptions, there aren't civil societies from that country who are at the table. And if they're not at the table, then they're not going to be part of the process when reforms are being designed or policies are being designed. And that's how you end up with these exclusions or these reforms that sound really good on paper, but then are just impossible to access for the average migrant worker. And it's ironic because one of the main principles of the GCM is this whole of society approach, and yet you see the primary beneficiary and most of society completely excluded from this. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've been through a lot of reviews in the past couple of weeks, so it's just been a little bit exhausting to see absolutely nothing applauded as progress when there's no evidence, and there can never be evidence, right? Because we're not allowed to freely report and to freely investigate. So yeah, I don't know. I just see it as states like setting milestones for themselves, and then they're reporting on themselves, and then what? We're all just kind of patting each other on the back for not doing much. I think, as I said, I think there's potential because PR is one of the few sort of opportunities where we can at least get some engagement from governments, but then it's on sort of us to, follow up with the monitoring and to make sure that something is actually changing. And I think, unfortunately, what we're also seeing is that, Gulf governments, what they're doing is increasingly normalized and increasingly not that distant from what everybody else is doing. If you look at, temporary migration regimes in the States, or the treatment of, refugees being expelled from European countries, where there's kind of like a global decline when it comes to migration governance. And I think that's partially why everyone is sort of just applauding the Gulf for what it's doing now. So.
And do you want to add, or Ali, do you want to add to that particular point?
Perfectly covered.
I agree. Actually, so we're actually at time now, so I think we can just allow a bit of time just to wrap up. Essentially, I was going to invite each of the three panelists to just draw on any final questions they wanted to address or make any kind of final statements. So if we just go for like another 5 to 10 minutes or so. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Thanks, man.
So I want to basically, because some of the questions do address that, about domestic workers and sectors that are feminized, hospitality, catering, cleaning, and how apart from domestic work, the other sectors as well are prone to subcontracting. So it's not direct employment, even in the hospitality sector. So you're seeing thousands and thousands of women coming in from patriarchal setups, but into even more patriarchal setups, where their existence as women itself is controlled, the existence of workers as well is controlled, and that together can be a very, very disempowering combination. And we're not seeing policies in destination countries addressing the needs of women migrants, because it's not like a few dozens, right? You're talking about a few millions. And you're not seeing origin countries looking at their migration policy from a gender lens beyond slapping bans on women migration. And that just makes it even worse. We haven't really touched upon irregularity or the extra vulnerabilities of irregular workers and the increase we see in irregular channels of migration, particularly from African countries. Again, that's not something we touched upon because it's a lot to cover in 90 minutes, but these are some of the areas that we need to look at. So your workers are coming from countries that are not familiar with the Gulf. Asia has a long history of migration. There is a trade, there's trade outside of labor migration as well. And you have storytelling around migration in Asian countries. None of these informative, pieces are there in emerging African countries. So workers coming from there are extremely vulnerable. So we need to look at how should we address this? And when I say workers, I'm also talking primarily about women workers coming in. In the case of UAE, coming in on visit visas and converting it to work visas or not converting and working irregularly with no protection from home or a destination. We keep celebrating the fact that 4 of the countries have a domestic workers law. Bahrain includes them in some provisions, Oman doesn't have. But that's not a celebration. Domestic work is work, and they should be included in labor law, which means they have access to grievance mechanisms, they have access to implementation, they have access to labor inspection, that sector. But creating a law that really is just a glorified standard contract, you're just marginalizing a very large group of workers. The care industry, which is, if you look at domestic work in the Gulf, a lot of it is care work. Is a growing industry. It's a growing sector. So you're going to see more and more women coming from these countries to take care of the elderly, of children, of services that are not being invested in. So yeah, just quickly to keep in mind about how women tend to be ignored in policy making, tend to be ignored in reporting. Any reporting on women is, okay, we have a group of domestic workers who are in trouble, but what is your access to justice? So to address all of that, and then to look at emerging source countries, particularly from Africa, and to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes, that the way we deal with it at the very early stages of that migration arrangement is rectified. Stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Vani. Ali, would you like to just make a kind of closing statement, address any things that you wanted to get in there before we finish?
Just going back of like the things that a citizen could do and within the restrictive environment, and just to be aware, not to fall victim to the narratives of, xenophobia and scapegoating, and keep in mind that, I don't want to make just the economic argument, but it's also a human argument, to fight for migrant rights and keep in mind that their rights are inseparable from your rights.
Thanks so much, Ali. And Rima, any final statement or thoughts from you?
Yeah, just two things, one of which will be a little bit less pessimistic than the other. Just a couple of things to look out for when we're seeing reforms to migration systems is that we're probably going to see the development of, much more relaxed systems for people who are at the very top. So these like privileged class of people with preferable skills or a lot of money. So we're already seeing that in the UAE. And then we're also seeing, relaxations of the system that are happening at the same time that other constraints on migration are happening. So if we look at, Saudi, for example, and its recent reforms is also happening after, a couple of years of making it much more difficult for families to live together in the Gulf. So I think we're going to see these trade-offs in any kinds of reforms that we see going forward. That being said, I think that where there is sort of some promise is in institutional and behavioral change. And I will kind of plug one of the groups, the projects that we have, which Vani leads, which is our Insaniat project, which engages youth in the region. And so these are future employers, or future members of parliament, future business leaders, and seeing how much capacity they have to change within the window of these very short 3-month fellowships, and then the effects that they have on the people around them, I think is very promising for developing this sort of groundswell of change that we will need to see any kind of real reforms to labor migration in the region.
Thank you, Rima. Really valuable closing statement there. I think so. We'll be drawing it to a close. So we just wanted to say thank you to everyone for participating in the webinar, for sending through your questions, which we tried to incorporate into as much of the discussions as possible, and everyone asking questions in the Q&A as well. Again, we did try to bring them into our answers and our questions as much as possible. I wanted to just thank Rima, Vani, and Ali for sharing their expertise and insights. I've really learned a lot from this conversation, and I think I'll just return to my original point, which is this is exactly why migrantrights.org is such a valuable resource. I think this conversation reflects the research analysis they do, which always puts workers at the heart of this. The benchmark for whether a reform is meaningful or not is how much change it makes for the worker. And I think if you want that analysis, then migrantrights.org is like the crucial, valuable resource to go to for that kind of very reality-based analysis. As I said, there's a recording of this webinar, which will be available on migrantrights.org's YouTube channel shortly after this. But yeah, thank you very much for everyone for engaging and for registering and for participating.